Hi, I'm Bob German, Cloud Developer Advocate for Microsoft. In this video, you'll learn how to implement single sign-on in a declarative agent for Microsoft 365 Copilot. This allows you to build an agent that calls your RESTful API using Entra ID in a way that's completely seamless to the end user. The user is already logged into Microsoft 365, and with SSO, users can access your API with that same identity, no extra logins. It just works. This video is part 2 of a series. In part 1, my colleague Rabia and I explained how to choose an authentication scheme for your declarative agent. If you missed that, you should go back and watch it now. There's a link in the show notes. Okay, I'll wait. Alright, if you want to build a declarative agent with single sign-on, then you've come to the right place. Here's Rabia, who will explain and demonstrate the steps for setting up SSO.
Here are the steps to enable SSO for your agent. First thing, you need to create a web service for your API. Then you need to create an app registration in the Microsoft Entra ID portal. You need to copy some details from that portal once you've done the registration. Then you go to Teams developer portal and register a vault and get the reference ID. Again, copy over the details from there. Update your app package where you would update the plugin manifest with the details that we got from step 2 and step 3. And then you also need to go back to the app registration in Microsoft Entra ID portal and update few information there from what we received from Teams developer portal. Finally, in step 6, you need to go ahead and update your application code in order to validate the token. All right, so let's take a look at the lab itself. On your left-hand side, you will be able to see what are the exercises that we're going to do. First off, we start with setting up a persistent developer tunnel. Now, this is entirely optional, but this will make your life so much easier because every time you kick off an FY of your project, it's going to give you a different URL to host your API because Teams Toolkit would use a tunnel to do this so that your API is accessible over the internet. Now, if you don't want to keep on updating all the configurations that you would do further down these exercises to keep on updating it with the URL every time you run FY or make changes to your application, it is better to set up the persistent developer tunnel. When you set it up this way, your URL does not change. It's because you're doing it separate to what Teams Toolkit is providing you with. So let's go ahead and have a look at how that is done. You need to install the developer tunnel once you've installed that, you will log in using the dev tunnel user login command. Once you've done that, you will go ahead and host the tunnel to the port 7071. So these are the CLI commands that you can go ahead and paste into your terminal and run a persistent tunnel. Let me just show you how I'm going to do that. I will open up my terminal and I will place the login command for dev tunnel. It will go ahead and log into my account. Once I'm logged in, I can close and come back to the terminal again. So I'm logged in as the user who will be using this entire project. Now, once that's done, I can come here and copy the create and host tunnel commands, which is what I'm going to do next. Once it's done, it will go ahead and create a URL for me. This will be persistent. So I can use this URL throughout the entire lab. And it doesn't matter if I start or stop the project using FY. So let me just copy that over. So the next step I do after I've gotten my persistent URL is that I need to disable what Teams Toolkit generates every time you run the project. So for that, I need to go to the VS Code folder, task.json, and disable start local tunnel tasks. So that's exactly what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to open up my project This is the FY lab 05, which is the previous lab to before authentication. This at the moment, this declarative agent and this entire application is non-authenticated. So what I'm going to do next is in the VS Code, go to task.json, unlocate the start local tunnel task, and then I will just go ahead and comment that out. Once that's done, I can go to the environmental variable in the next step to add the persistent URL value in there that I copied over earlier. So let me just do that. Go to env.local and then copy and paste. Oops. All right, so next go ahead and find out what are the next steps. We need to register an Entra ID application. So for that, we need to go to the Entra ID portal. So I've already opened up the Entra ID portal and app registrations. So we'll go ahead and create a new registration. Let's just quickly go through what they want us to do. So they want to register an application, give it a name, Tray API service, looks good, SQL tenant, and then register. So once you've done that, you need to copy over the application ID and the tenant ID information. And also, we will be doing another registration in the Teams developer portal. So before we go into that, let's go ahead and find out how we can create an Entra ID application first. So in the app registration, I'm creating the Tray API service app, and I'm just going to ignore this platform at the moment. We will come back and do this later on in the coming steps. So I'm registering it, and as they've mentioned, we will copy over the client ID and the tenant ID. Once copied over, let's go ahead and find out what we need to do next, which is registering the Entra SSO client ID in Teams developer portal. I also happen to open the Teams developer portal tools, where you will find the Microsoft Entra SSO client ID registration button. Click on that, and here you will find all the registrations you've done before. You can register a new client, and we just have to give it a registration name, Tray API SSO, the base URL, which is your persistent URL. So let's go back and confirm that again. So yeah, that's the URL, my organization, any Teams application, and the client ID, which we just copied over from the Entra ID portal. I'm just going to do that and then save. Once you've saved, you'll get the SSO registration ID. You need to copy this as well, because you will be updating the plugin manifest with this registration ID. You would also need this application ID URI later on to update the Entra ID application that you just created, which is called the Tray API service. You need to go back and add this for exposing your API. So let's go ahead and find out what else we need to do in the lab. All right, so we've done that registration. We'll go ahead and update the application package. Like I mentioned, the reference ID that the Teams developer portal gave you is needed to fill in and update the authentication settings for your agent. So we'll need to go back to the project in app package tray-plugin.json file and change the authentication, which is at the moment none, to this particular tab. I'm going to copy this script over, and let's go back to the code. I will open up the app package tray plugin, and here you can see the auth type is none. Let's paste the new value, and you also need to paste the reference. So let me just do that. I'm going to paste that value in, and I think this setting is now done. Once done, let's go back and see what else we need to do. We need to update the API's Microsoft Entra app registration. Like I mentioned, there is an application ID URI also given to you by the Teams developer portal. So you need to copy this and update the Tray API service, the app registration in the Entra ID portal. So you can click here, the application ID URI, and add it and save. Once you've done that, you need to add a scope for accessing your API. Let's go ahead and find out what steps are needed for that. So you need to add an API scope. We'll call it access as a user. And these are the things that you need to fill out once we are adding the scope. So going back, admin and user, admin for the display name and the description. I'm just going to copy over from the lab because it's easy. I've put it in a table, so it's easy to copy and paste. So let's just quickly run through that. I've added the scope. Now there's one more bit to be done in this page, is adding a client application. Now, if you look at the lab code, they've mentioned that there is this Microsoft Enterprise token store that needed to be added as a client application in this particular setting to authorize it to access. So let's go back and put this exact same GUI ID into the applications that are authorized. We've done that. Next up, we will be doing some stuff around the authentication area because remember, we didn't configure the platform. So let's go back to the lab and figure out what needs to be done. So there is a redirect URL, which is also again a constant. This is from the Teams platform to redirect the agent to do all the authentication flow. You need to copy that over, go to authentication and add a web platform. So let's just do that quickly. Add a platform, web, and the redirect URL pasted and configured. Right, so that's done. Let's go back and figure out what's the next step. So the configuration part of the Entra ID application, the Teams developer portal, all that is done now, but your application is still not authorized, or it does not have the authentication set in place unless you put some code in to validate the token, saying that, okay, this is a valid token for you to do this operation. So for that, I will hand it over to Bob to show you how to implement the application code, which will do exactly that. Over to you, Bob.
At the time of this recording, Microsoft doesn't have a supported library for validating Entra ID access tokens. We have a library called msal, which allows you to obtain a token if you're on the client side, but if you're on the server side, you're left with a complex set of instructions to build your own validation logic to make sure that that access token is okay. My colleague Waldeck Mastercards has written a library based on this guidance, and that's what we're going to use here. However, you should know that it's not officially supported. It's supported by the community, and it uses an MIT license, which kind of means use it at your own risk. Now let's walk through the code, and I'll show you how it works. All right, so I'm going to start by installing that JWT package, that JWT validate package, and check that off in the labs. And now I need to add a couple of environment variables so that the code can get to some of those settings. Specifically, I need the tenant ID and the app ID URI because those are going to be used as part of the token validation. So I'll just copy those over from where I saved them earlier. I used Visual Notepad. Of course, you want to make sure that this stuff is safely squirreled away, so I'm going to delete that later. And all my settings will be deleted before this airs, so it doesn't matter in this case. But in any case, the next thing I need to do is reference these from inside of the Teams package, teamsapp.local.yml, the YAML file. And all this is going to do is take those environment variables and expose them into my code. So by default, the environment variables are used internally by Teams Toolkit. Oops, I think I pasted a little more than I meant to. And we just want these settings to be available in the environment variables of the code. So now there's a bunch of changes to make to the code. So let's do a side-by-side view so you can see exactly what we're going to do. Now, if you're not familiar with this code, we didn't really provide a tour of it. It's a pretty standard Azure function. And that function is calling every Azure function at the top of it is calling this identity service. And that's what I'm going to update now. So if you go through the labs, you can get the exact details. But basically, I'm referencing the library. And then I'm going to make a new local variable called token validator, because we want to keep this validator around. We want to reuse it with every request. It's more efficient that way. It will manage caching for us. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. We're going to start by getting the environment variables into local variables, and then we'll pull out the authorization header, which contains the access token. It's bearer, space, and then the token. So we'll get that out. And if we don't find that, we'll just throw an exception and return the 401. If we do have one, then we're going to reuse the validator if possible. And if not, we'll make a new one. And we need to pass in the tenant ID because it's going to actually the library is actually going to retrieve the public keys that will be used to validate this token cryptographically. And that depends partly on the tenant ID. So that's what's happening there. So now we're going to set up the options for the library to use in validating the token. And we're going to validate on the audience, which should be the app ID URI, the issuer, which is set to a single tenant in the public Azure environment. So there's some notes in the comments. If you are in a different cloud or if you're multi-tenant, you might need to change this. And then also the scope is what we set in, you saw Rabia set this in the app registration, is access as user. So that's the permission that we're actually going to check when we go to validate the token. Finally, we'll actually do the validation. And the way this works is it throws an exception if it doesn't pass validation. And in the exception logic, we will again return a 401 unauthorized error. However, if it does work, we will extract the user ID, the username, and the user email from the token and pass it into the Azure function so that it can enforce permissions and know whose projects it is that we've requested. Returning to the lab, let's go ahead and run this. So one last thing before we do that, I'm going to increment the manifest version number, which will sort of force Microsoft 365 to reload the app after I've installed it again. Sometimes it works without that, but it's a good practice to make sure you're getting a fresh copy. And here we are. So let's go ahead and test this out. Now, if it says I'm Avery Howard, that's the hard-coded user ID, and I think we've overridden that now. It's going to ask permission to call the API, which is normal. So we'll go ahead and do that. And hey, it knows that I'm Amber, which is actually the user I'm logged in as. So that is working well. And I can even add myself to a project. This is something that only that user is permitted to do. And you can see that it's going to work. It knows who I am. And there we go. I've been successfully added to the project. And if I double check that and ask who's working on this project, I should see that Amber has been added in there.
If you liked this video, please check out the hands-on lab and try it yourself. The lab is part of Copilot Developer Camp and is lab number E6C. I'll put a link in the show notes. And as always, we appreciate if you give us a like and subscribe to the Microsoft 365 Developer channel so you don't miss any of our future videos. Thanks!